Hello, my name is Stuart Brooker. I'm 26 years old. I was born 25th of May 1984. I'm technically half Sri Lankan. My parents, well, my mother, all my mother's side of the family were all born and raised in Sri Lanka, and at some point before I was born they all decided to move to England momentarily, but before deciding to move to Melbourne in Australia. But by that point my mum had met my dad. She remained here in England while they all emigrated off. I was born in Chichester but raised in Bognor Regis on the south coast. When I was 3 years old, my parents called me downstairs and told me they were getting a divorce. I remember that. And I went to live with my mother. But I visited Dad at weekends, and they both lived around the same area and remained mutual friends. And when I was 6, a sort of major event was I got lost in Bognor Regis town centre. I was with my grandfather alone at the time, and we became separated. The first thought I had at that age was to walk home. It was a 45-minute walk from the town centre to my house. And obviously by the time I got back home, all my family were there and fretting. They'd called the police, but I think that set the scene for me having quite an independent sort of mentality and wanting to lead a sort of independent lifestyle. Both my parents eventually remarried and had children with their respective partners, and I was best man for Dad's wedding when I was 10 years old. I had to give a speech and all the proper best man duties. Soon after, a few years later, I went to secondary school, and my parents were called in, and I later found out that my grades and results meant that I was one of the top 6 students in the school. And it was about that time that began living more and more with my grandparents. Their house backed onto the school field, and they were my father's parents, but it used to be convenient to travel from my mum's to my nan's and granddad's and pick up my bag and go to school. And then after school come back to my grandparents' house and have dinner before making my way back to my mum's house in the early evening. And eventually I spent more and more time with my grandparents and less time with both my parents, until eventually I didn't come home. Eventually I didn't have a room at my mother's house for about a year or so. It was being used by people coming to visit, whereas I had a room at my grandparents' house. So in the end I just started living with them full time. I became quite an average teenager, which led to pretty average A-level results. And after leaving secondary school I went travelling. I went to Singapore, Bali and Australia up the east coast. It was the first time I'd been in countries on my own. Quite fulfilling, learned quite a lot. I was pickpocketed by prostitutes in Bali and went to the clubs a couple of days before the Bali bombings occurred. I was actually due to go back with someone I'd met there on the night of the bombings if I hadn't got a flight out to Australia. I just went to the airport and tried to get a flight there and then. So I learnt a lot on my travels, but I came back early. I'd been with a girl now who I'd loved since secondary school, really. I'd known her and I'd always really liked her, and then soon after I went travelling she told me that she liked me, and there was that disease sort of teenage love. But I came back early and she was having some family troubles, and a few days later she left me to go out with another one of my school friends, which was really crushing. That was my first ever long-term relationship. But at that point I'd just come back and I needed money, and I started working at Waterstones full-time in Chichester. Soon after I met another girl who I worked with, and on her leaving do we hooked up, and we were eventually together for 2.5 years. In November 2004, I was at home with my grandfather and my nan collapsed and died in the hallway soon after. Probably one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, seeing as we were both there and there was nothing we could do really. And often when I go back, I still live with my grandfather, when I go back home from uni, we talk about Nan a lot. A few years after her death, he had a heart attack in the lounge. Again, I was there, but luckily this time we called an ambulance in time and he made a pretty full recovery. Soon after my nan's death, sort of the beginning of 2005, I left my girlfriend of 2.5 years. I'd actually met another girl who I'd worked with at Waterstones, and I essentially left my ex-girlfriend to be with this girl who I actually been with now for 4.5 years. She's still my current girlfriend. When we got together, I told her that I wanted to go to uni. I was approaching sort of 23 years old and 22 or so, and she agreed. I think my parents had both given up hope of me going to uni. I'd been working full-time for a few years and but I applied, and at the same time she applied for a job here in Reading, which was one of the unis that I'd applied for, and she got the job and I got the placement at uni, so we both ended up moving to Reading together. So I think it's definitely made it easier for us living together in the same town.